My neighbor decided my empty dirt lot was her personal free parking spot. I put up big, bright, no parking signs. She ignored them completely. So I installed heavy-duty industrial sprinklers with a timer and turned them on at midnight when the temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, her $50,000 luxury SUV had become a solid iceberg, frozen solid to my field. Now she knows. Sometimes, just a field can cost you $4,000 and a whole lot of dignity. You ever have one of those days where you just want to go home, sit on your couch in absolute silence, and pretend the rest of the entire human race does not exist? I think anyone who works a regular job has those days. You put in your 8 hours, or maybe 10 or 12 if your boss is one of those micromanagers who treats breathing company air as a privilege, and all you want is peace. You drive home through rush hour traffic that makes you seriously question the general intelligence of your fellow citizens, dodging people who apparently got their driver's licenses out of a cereal box, and you just want your sanctuary. That is literally it. Just a quiet space that belongs exclusively to you. That is the entire reason I bought the empty dirt lot right next to my house. I am not some wealthy real estate mogul trying to build a property empire. I am just a regular exhausted guy working in tech support, dealing with people who do not know how to plug in a monitor all day. I saved up my money for years because the idea of some developer buying that slice of land and building a giant, ugly, multi-story house 3 feet from my bedroom window gave me absolute hives. I needed a buffer zone. A nice little slice of dirt, weeds, and silence that separated me from the overwhelming madness of the suburbs. I figured I would eventually plant some trees there, maybe build a small garden, or just leave it exactly as it was. Most of the time, I just liked looking out my kitchen window and seeing absolutely nothing, just empty, glorious space. It was my personal void, my visual palate cleanser after a long day of screens and stupidity, and I loved it. But of course, we cannot have nice things in this world, can we? Because wherever there is peace, there is always someone whose sole purpose in life is to ruin it. Enter my neighbor from across the street. I am going to call her Brenda because she looked and acted exactly like a Brenda. Let me paint a picture for you because you need to understand the level of sheer, unadulterated entitlement we are dealing with here. Brenda was in her early 50s, with hair bleached so aggressively blonde that it was practically translucent in the sunlight. She perpetually wore those massive, oversized, bug-eyed designer sunglasses that covered half of her face, even when it was overcast, raining, or literally pitch black outside. I do not think I ever actually saw her eyeballs. She dressed entirely in expensive, name-brand athletic wear, despite the fact that I had never, not once in the 3 years she lived there, seen her do anything even remotely strenuous. The most exercise she got was carrying a venti iced coffee from her driveway to her front door while yelling at someone on her phone. And her voice, oh man, her voice was a weapon of mass destruction. It was this nasal, grating, high-pitched whine that sounded exactly like a seagull fighting a leaf blower. You could hear her complaining about the weather from 3 houses down. Brenda and her husband lived directly across the street from me, and they were the proud owners of a fleet of obnoxious vehicles. Her husband had this ridiculously loud, cherry-red midlife crisis sports car that he only drove on alternating Sundays when the humidity was exactly right. It sat in their 2-car garage, taking up precious space and gathering dust. Then there was their son, who had recently moved back home after his brilliant tech startup idea inevitably failed. He brought with him a heavily modified import tuner car with a muffler that sounded like a continuous chain of firecrackers exploding in a tin can. He parked that monstrosity in the driveway. And then there was Brenda's daily driver. Calling it a car is an insult to cars. It was an absolute leviathan of a vehicle. A massive, pristine, white, top-of-the-line, luxury sport utility vehicle. The kind of ridiculous, tank-like machine that costs more than my entire college education, gets about 4 miles to the gallon. and has enough interior space to comfortably host a small wedding reception. It was so unnecessarily huge that it practically had its own gravitational pull. It had all-wheel drive, off-road suspension, and heavy-duty tires. But I guarantee you this pristine white behemoth had never touched anything rougher than the slightly uneven pavement of a high-end shopping mall parking lot. Now, because the husband's sports car was in the garage and the son's noisy failure mobile was in the driveway, Brenda's pristine white tank was relegated to the street. Parking on the street in our neighborhood is perfectly legal. It is annoying when people park directly across from each other and turn a two-lane road into a single-lane obstacle course. But it is legal. However, Brenda did not like parking on the street. She claimed the neighborhood kids rode their bicycles too close to her precious vehicle, and she was absolutely terrified that a stray handlebar or a rogue basketball might scratch her flawless, shimmering white paint job. So, what was her brilliant, problem-solving solution to this terrible dilemma? Did she ask her husband to park his toy in the driveway? Did she ask her son to park down the road where it was wider and safer? Of course not. Why inconvenience her own family when she could inconvenience me instead? She decided without asking, without so much as a polite wave, that my vacant dirt lot was her brand new personal VIP parking space. The very first time it happened, I actually thought there was a genuine emergency. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, eating a sad bowl of cereal for dinner because I was too tired to cook, when I saw headlights sweep across my blinds. I watched in total disbelief as this massive white block of German engineering rolled right over the curb, violently crushed my small patch of native wildflowers, and parked dead center in my dirt lot. I threw on my shoes and marched outside, fully expecting to see a bewildered driver with a flat tire or a blown engine. But no, the driver's side door swings open, and out pops Brenda. She is holding her giant plastic iced coffee cup, perfectly balanced, and she hits the lock button on her key fob. The car lets out a loud, obnoxious double honk that echoes through the quiet street, folding its mirrors in like some kind of transforming robot. I jogged over to the edge of the lot and said, in a remarkably calm voice considering the circumstances, "Hey, Brenda, is everything all right with the car? Did it break down?" She stopped, turned slowly, looked at me from over the rim of her giant sunglasses, and let out a sigh so dramatic it could have won an Academy Award. It was a sigh that communicated how utterly exhausting it was for her to have to acknowledge my existence. She took a sip of her coffee and said, "Oh, it is totally fine. The street is just way too narrow right now, and I really do not want anyone clipping my side mirrors. Kids are so careless these days. I will just leave it here for the night. It is safer." I blinked. I actually lost the ability to process human speech for a solid 5 seconds. My brain essentially blue-screened. I finally managed to gather my thoughts and said, "Brenda, you absolutely cannot park here. This is my private property. I bought this lot last year. I pay property taxes on it. You cannot just use it as your personal driveway." And do you know what she said? This is the exact moment my mild annoyance mutated into a deep, burning resentment. She waved her hand dismissively at me, her chunky gold bracelets clanking together loudly, and she let out a condescending little laugh. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "It is literally just a field. It is just dirt and weeds. You are not even doing anything with it. It is completely empty. Why are you making such a big deal out of nothing?" I felt my blood pressure spike. I told her that was entirely beside the point. It is my dirt. It is my field. If I want to sit in the exact middle of it in a folding chair and stare at the moon, that is my legal right as the property owner. You cannot just drive your 6,000-pound luxury land yacht onto my land without permission. She scoffed, adjusted her designer bag on her shoulder, and said, "Well, I am already parked, and I am already in my comfortable slippers. I am not moving it right now. I will move it tomorrow morning. Seriously, do not be such a bad neighbor." And with that, she turned her back on me and waddled her way across the street, disappearing into her house. A bad neighbor. She had literally trespassed on my land, crushed the only plants I had actively tried to grow, treated me like a pesky peasant, and then had the absolute audacity to call me a bad neighbor. I went back inside my house absolutely fuming. I paced the floor. I thought about all the things I should have said. I should have called a tow truck right then and there. I really should have. But I am a naturally non-confrontational guy. I try to be the bigger person. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was just having a terrible day and that she would move it the next morning and never do it again. I foolishly believed in basic human decency. I was so incredibly naive. The very next evening, right around 6:30, I'm in my living room trying to unwind by watching a documentary about deep sea fish, and I hear that horribly familiar crunch of heavy tires on gravel and dirt. I look out my window, and there she is, parking in the exact same spot. In fact, she left even deeper, uglier tire ruts this time because it had rained for a few hours earlier that afternoon, turning the top layer of dirt into soft mud. I did not even grab my jacket. I stormed outside into the chilly air. I did not bother with pleasantries or polite inquiries this time. I walked right up to the edge of the lot and told her, in a voice that was shaking with anger, that she needed to move her vehicle immediately, or I was going to take action. She did her little theatrical sigh again. She leaned against the door of her pristine white tank and said she was utterly exhausted from running errands all day, that her feet hurt, and that I was being completely unreasonable and hostile. I told her that if she did not get back in her car and move it off my property right that second, I was going to call a towing company and have it forcefully removed. She literally laughed in my face. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a high-pitched, mocking, incredibly arrogant laugh. She looked me up and down and said, "Go ahead, call them. No tow truck company in this entire county is going to pull a massive all-wheel drive vehicle out of a muddy, unpaved field in the dark without a signed contract and proper legal signage. You do not even have a single no trespassing sign posted anywhere. You have zero authority here. Have a good night." She locked the car, gave me a sarcastic little wave, and walked away. The absolute worst part of that entire interaction was the sickening realization that she might actually be right. I practically sprinted back inside my house, grabbed my phone, and spent the next 2 excruciating hours calling every single towing company within a 20-mile radius. I must have called 12 different dispatchers, and every single one of them told me the exact same depressing story. Because it was an unpaved, completely unmarked dirt lot without a defined driveway, it was considered a massive liability nightmare for them. If their heavy tow truck drove onto the soft dirt and got stuck in the mud, or if they accidentally damaged her precious luxury vehicle dragging it over the uneven terrain, they could be sued for thousands of dollars. They told me that legally, I needed to post clear, compliant, no parking signs, wait a mandatory 48 hours, and then file a formal trespassing report with the non-emergency police department before any reputable towing company would even consider sending a truck out there. I was livid. The bureaucratic system was literally protecting the person who was blatantly breaking the rules simply because enforcing the rules was too financially risky. I barely slept that night. I was fueled entirely by spite and black coffee the next morning. As soon as the sun came up, I drove straight to the largest local hardware store. I did not buy the small, polite signs. I walked down the aisle and bought the biggest, brightest, absolute ugliest neon orange, reflective no parking signs they had in stock. I bought heavy-duty metal stakes. I bought a 10-pound sledgehammer. I went back home and spent 3 exhausting, sweaty hours driving those metal stakes deep into the hard, rocky earth right at the front boundary of my property. I positioned them perfectly so that any vehicle attempting to enter the lot would have to drive directly between them. They were practically glowing in the daylight. You could not miss them even if you were legally blind. But I did not stop there. I went inside and wrote a highly formal, legally aggressive warning letter. I stated with crystal clarity that any unauthorized vehicles parked on this specific parcel of private land would be towed immediately at the owner's sole expense, and that by crossing the property line, the vehicle owner assumed 100% of the liability for any damages incurred during the removal process. I printed it out, slipped it into a clear waterproof plastic sleeve, marched across the street, and taped it right at eye level on Brenda's pristine front door. It was polite in its language, but absolutely ruthless in its intent. It was legally airtight. I took wide-angle photos of the signs on my lot, close-up photos of the letter taped to her door, and saved everything to a dedicated folder on my phone. I went to bed that night feeling a deep, profound sense of victory. I had followed the rules. I had established the boundaries. The system was now on my side. 2 entire days passed without an incident. Brenda parked her massive white tank on the street, tightly hugging the curb, exactly where she should have been parking the entire time. I felt this immense, soothing sense of relief. The neon orange signs had worked. The threat of financial consequence had penetrated her bubble of entitlement. But my relief was incredibly short-lived. On the 3rd night, a Friday evening, it happened again. Brenda decided to host a little get-together. She had about half a dozen friends over. They were standing out on her front porch, drinking copious amounts of white wine, laughing loudly, and being generally obnoxious. Her friends had filled up the street parking directly in front of her house. So, where did Brenda decide to park her giant white tank to make convenient room for her esteemed guests? Right exactly between my 2 glowing neon orange no parking signs. She actually had to maneuver her steering wheel carefully, inching forward at a snail's pace, just to avoid scratching her paint on the metal stakes I had driven into the ground. I was sitting on my couch when I saw the headlights. I walked to the window, completely baffled by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of what I was witnessing. I put my shoes on and walked out there. She saw me coming from across the street. She leaned heavily over her decorative porch railing, a half-empty glass of wine dangling from her hand, and before I could even open my mouth, she yelled out across the asphalt, "Oh, just relax. It is literally just for tonight. My friends needed the street space. Do not be such a miserable party pooper." I pointed a rigid finger at the glowing orange signs. I pointed at her massive vehicle. I shouted back, my voice echoing down the street, that she was trespassing on explicitly marked private property and that she was completely out of line. She turned around to face her friends, let out a theatrical, bubbling laugh, and said loudly enough for the entire block to hear, "Ignore him, girls. He is just a lonely, sad little man with absolutely nothing better to do with his pathetic life than police a useless patch of ugly weeds." Her friends all giggled and took sips of their wine, looking at me like I was the neighborhood crazy person. I did not say another word. I turned around, walked back inside my house, shut my front door, and locked it. I was physically shaking. The rage I felt in that moment transcended mere annoyance about a parking spot. It was no longer just about the physical space her car was occupying. It was about the absolute, fundamental lack of human respect. It was the sickening realization that she genuinely viewed me as a lesser being, that my private property was basically public domain for her personal convenience simply because she deemed my lifestyle less important than hers. I realized right then and there that talking to her like a rational adult was never going to work. Putting up legally binding signs was never going to work. The police were far too busy dealing with actual emergencies to come enforce a minor civil parking dispute in a timely manner. The tow trucks were too terrified of getting sued over a muddy bumper. I needed a solution that completely bypassed the bureaucracy. I needed to teach her a lesson she would never, ever forget. I needed to construct a scenario where parking on my lot became the single most regrettable decision of her year. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a tall glass of ice water to cool down, and started pacing the length of my house. I walked back and forth, staring out the window at her gleaming white vehicle sitting arrogantly in the dark. I pulled out my phone and absent-mindedly opened the weather application. We were heading deep into late November. The temperatures had been dropping steadily all week, stripping the last of the leaves off the trees. As I scrolled through the detailed hourly forecast, I noticed a massive alert banner at the top of the screen. There was a severe, brutal cold front moving down from the north over the weekend. The meteorologists were predicting an incredibly hard, sustained freeze starting late Sunday night and lasting well into Monday morning. The temperatures were projected to dive straight down into the low teens. The local news stations had been running segments all week, warning homeowners to wrap their exterior pipes, drip their indoor faucets, and bring their pets inside. I stared at the weather forecast. I stared at her car. I stared at the forecast again. And that is exactly when the epiphany hit me. It was an idea so beautifully petty, so brilliantly destructive, and yet completely, undeniably legal. I had originally bought that vacant lot with the vague intention of putting a garden in. I had been meaning to eventually install a proper irrigation system because dragging a rubber hose out there by hand was going to be a miserable chore. I wanted to prep the hard dirt for some winter grass seed to keep the dust down during the dry season and maybe plant some small fruit trees in the early spring. Since the ground was so dry and compacted, giving it a really deep, thorough soaking was a perfectly logical agricultural step. And why not install a heavy-duty, permanent sprinkler system right now? After all, it is my private property. I pay the taxes on it. I have the absolute right to water my own dirt whenever I see fit, even if it happens to be the coldest night of the entire year. The next morning was Saturday. I woke up at 6 o'clock, fueled by a terrifying amount of motivation. I bypassed the standard retail home improvement stores because they only sell cheap, flimsy plastic lawn stuff that breaks if you look at it wrong. I drove 30 minutes out of town to a massive commercial irrigation supply warehouse. This was the place where professional landscapers, golf course groundskeepers, and commercial farmers bought their heavy-duty gear. I walked in and purchased 3 industrial-grade, high-impact brass sprinkler heads. These were not the cute little oscillating fans that gently mist a suburban lawn. These were serious, heavy metal, pulsing water cannons designed to shoot a solid high-pressure jet of water 30 to 40 feet through the air. I also bought hundreds of feet of heavy gauge, reinforced rubber hoses, a digital 4-way manifold timer, and a special brass adapter piece. This adapter was crucial. It allowed me to hook the manifold directly into my main exterior water line, completely bypassing the standard residential pressure regulator. I wanted maximum unfiltered municipal water pressure. I drove home and spent the entire duration of the weekend installing this glorious trap. And let me tell you, it was absolutely exhausting, miserable labor. I am a guy who works at a computer desk. I am not a plumber. I am not a landscaper. I am just a highly motivated, incredibly petty man who watches a 15-minute instructional video on the internet and immediately assumes he possesses the skills of a master tradesman. I spent all of Saturday afternoon digging shallow trenches in the freezing cold wind. The top layer of the ground was already getting hard from the dropping temperatures. My knuckles were scraped and bleeding, my boots were caked in freezing mud, my back was screaming in agony, and my fingers were completely numb. But every single time I struck the dirt with my shovel, I muttered Brenda's name like a dark incantation. Spite is an incredibly powerful energy source. I painstakingly set the 3 brass sprinkler heads into a perfect, calculated triangle. I placed one at the far back boundary of the lot, one deep on the left side, and one deep on the right side. And the exact center point of that triangulated kill zone, the precise patch of crushed weeds where Brenda absolutely loved to park her white tank. I hooked up all the heavy reinforced hoses, buried them under a shallow layer of loose dirt and dead leaves so they were not immediately obvious to a casual observer, and routed them all back to the digital timer attached to the side of my house. By Sunday afternoon, just before the sun started to go down and the real freeze began to set in, I decided to do a test run. I opened the main water valve. The thick rubber hoses groaned under the sudden influx of pressure, swelling up like giant black pythons in the dirt. And then, With a loud, aggressive, mechanical clack, 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 the 3 brass sprinklers violently erupted to life. The water pressure was absolutely terrifying. Thick, heavy, concentrated streams of water blasted furiously across the vacant lot, perfectly crisscrossing and colliding right in the dead center, absolutely drenching the exact footprint where her car usually sat. Because I had bypassed the pressure regulator, the water was hitting with enough sheer force that if you stood in the middle of it, it would physically sting your skin. It was a torrential, localized hurricane. It was glorious. I shut the main valve off, completely satisfied. I programmed the digital manifold timer to click on at exactly midnight and run continuously, without stopping, until exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. 6 straight hours of high-pressure water. I went inside, took a scalding hot shower to wash off the freezing mud, ordered a pizza, and waited. Sunday night rolled around, and the temperature outside began plummeting at a terrifying rate. By 8 o'clock in the evening, there was already a thick layer of frost forming on the edges of my living room windows. The wind was howling down the street. I kept peeking out through the gaps in my blinds, my heart pounding against my ribs. Would she actually park there tonight? Her obnoxious friends had long since gone home. Her own driveway had plenty of space because her son had taken his loud tuner car out for the night. She had absolutely no logical reason whatsoever to park on my vacant lot. But I was banking on a psychological flaw. Entitlement is a very funny, stubborn thing. Once an entitled person aggressively claims something as their own, they will continually go out of their way to keep taking it, even when it is inconvenient for them, just to prove a point. Just to show you that they can. Sure enough, at exactly 8:30, I see a pair of blindingly bright headlights sweep across my living room wall. I hold my breath as I watch the massive, gleaming white luxury vehicle pull up to the curb. She pauses for a brief second, her headlights illuminating my giant, glowing neon orange signs. I can almost see the gears turning in her head. And then, defying all logic and common sense, she aggressively hits the gas pedal, rolls her heavy tires right over the concrete curb, and parks her vehicle dead center in the middle of my triangulated trap. She turns off the engine, steps out of the car wrapped in a massive, puffy designer winter coat, double-clicks her key fob to lock the doors, and hurries across the freezing street to the warm safety of her house. I literally did a quiet, celebratory little dance right there in my kitchen. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was absolutely insane. I felt like a brilliant cartoon supervillain standing eagerly beside a giant red destruction button. I sat down at my kitchen table and just watched the clock on the microwave. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. I checked the digital thermometer mounted on my back porch. The temperature had dropped to an absolutely brutal 14 degrees. It was bitterly, painfully cold outside. The street was completely deserted. Everything was completely still and silent. At 11:55, I put my heavy winter coat on, opened my back door, and stepped out onto my patio just to listen. I wanted to experience the moment in person. Midnight struck. From the dark corner of my house, I heard the sharp electronic click of the manifold timer engaging its solenoids. A split second later, the deep, rushing sound of high-pressure water instantly filled the heavy rubber hoses. And then, the greatest symphony I have ever heard in my entire life began. Clack, 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 clack. The 3 industrial brass sprinklers roared to life simultaneously. Even in the pitch-black dark, faintly illuminated by the distant amber glow of the single street lamp down the block, I could clearly see the massive, sweeping arcs of water violently blasting across the lot. They were hitting the pristine white luxury vehicle from 3 completely different angles at maximum velocity. The sound of the heavy water repeatedly hammering against the metal doors and glass windows was incredibly loud. I panicked for a brief, terrifying second, thinking the noise would wake her up. But her house was all the way across the street, all her double-paned windows were shut tight against the freezing wind, and her central heating unit was undoubtedly blasting warm air. She was completely, entirely oblivious to the destruction happening 50 feet away. I stayed awake for another solid hour, standing by the window in the dark, just watching the process. The wind picked up, making the ambient temperature even colder. The massive volume of water hitting the metal vehicle was not just rolling off onto the dirt. The temperature was so incredibly low that the water was freezing almost instantaneously upon contact. Within the first 45 minutes, the shiny, flawless white paint was completely covered in a dull, milky, opaque glaze of ice. The sprinklers just kept pounding away, relentlessly adding layer upon layer upon layer. The roof, the tinted windows, the chrome door handles, the massive front grille. All of it was slowly getting buried. I eventually forced myself to go to bed, though I slept absolutely terribly. I was vibrating with nervous energy. I kept waking up every 40 minutes, straining my ears to listen for the rhythmic clack of the sprinklers, absolutely terrified that a hose would suddenly burst or the digital timer would randomly fail. But every single time I checked the window, the system was performing flawlessly. I woke up naturally at 6:30 in the morning. The sky outside was just starting to turn a pale, bruised purple as the sun peeked over the horizon. The digital timer had successfully shut off the water at exactly 6 o'clock, just as I had programmed it to do. I walked into my kitchen, made myself a steaming hot mug of black coffee, and walked toward the front window. My hands were actually shaking, rattling the ceramic mug. I reached out, took a deep breath, and slowly pulled back the plastic blinds. I almost dropped my coffee mug on the floor, my jaw physically unhinged. The sight before me was so far beyond my wildest, most optimistic expectations that my brain struggled to process it. It was a genuine masterpiece of petty revenge. The pristine white luxury vehicle was no longer a vehicle. It was a literal iceberg. It looked like a forgotten prop from a big-budget, post-apocalyptic winter survival movie. There was at least 2 solid inches of hard, crystal-clear ice permanently coating every single square inch of the exterior surface. The functional gaps between the heavy doors and the frame were completely fused solid. The front windshield wipers were buried deep beneath a thick, impenetrable glacier of frozen water. The expensive folding side mirrors looked like massive, misshapen frozen teardrops. Sharp, jagged icicles a full foot long hung menacingly from the front bumper, extending all the way down to touch the frozen dirt below. The sheer volume of heavy spray from the 3 commercial sprinklers had accumulated, frozen, and accumulated again for 6 continuous hours. Worst of all, the heavy tires were completely encased in the deep mud ruts she had created, and those muddy ruts were now frozen completely solid to the earth itself. The car was welded to the ground. It was the single most beautiful, majestic thing I had ever laid eyes on in my entire life. I pulled up a dining chair, sat comfortably at my window, sipped my hot coffee, and eagerly waited for the morning show to begin. Brenda had a very strict, predictable routine. She usually left the house for her morning coffee and pastry run right around 8 o'clock. At exactly 7:45, her heavy front door swung open. Out came Brenda. She was bundled up in a massive, ridiculously fluffy designer faux fur coat, clutching her expensive leather purse, holding her keys, and wearing her signature oversized sunglasses firmly in place despite the gloomy, overcast sky. She confidently walked down her paved driveway, looking down at her phone, completely oblivious to the frozen monument of consequences waiting across the street. She stepped off the curb, looked up from her phone, and stopped dead in her tracks. Even from my vantage point behind the glass, 50 feet away, I could see her entire body go perfectly rigid. She literally dropped her keys. They landed on the cold asphalt with a faint metallic jingle. She stood frozen on the edge of the street, just staring for a full 60 seconds. Her brain was clearly failing to comprehend the physics of what she was looking at. Then, the shock wore off, and she started speed-walking aggressively across the street. She reached the edge of my vacant lot and confidently tried to step onto the dirt, completely forgetting the environmental conditions. The ground around her vehicle was basically an Olympic-level ice skating rink from the hours of freezing overspray. Her expensive boots hit the slick ice. Her feet instantly flew out from under her, and she flailed her arms wildly in the air. She almost went down hard on her back, but managed to desperately grab onto one of my sturdy, metal neon orange no parking signs to catch her balance. Oh, the poetic irony of that specific moment was sweeter than any dessert I have ever tasted. She carefully shimmied and shuffled her way across the treacherous ice until she reached the side of her vehicle. She reached out with a leather-gloved hand and tentatively tapped the thick ice covering the driver's side door. It made a hard, dull, hollow thud. She balled her hand into a fist and hit it much harder. Nothing happened, not even a microscopic crack. She started frantically, desperately scraping at the area where her door handle was supposed to be with her gloved fingers. But there was no handle. There was absolutely nothing to grab. There was just a perfectly smooth, 2-inch thick hump of impenetrable solid ice where the handle used to reside. And that is the exact moment the screaming finally started. She threw her head back and let out a piercing, unhinged shriek that probably woke up dogs 3 streets over. She started looking around wildly, her face turning a vibrant shade of crimson that usually precedes a serious medical emergency. She whipped her head around, looked directly at my house, and saw me standing perfectly still in my window, calmly holding my coffee mug and smiling at her. She absolutely, totally lost her mind. She started stomping her expensive boots on the ice, screaming strings of furious words I could not quite make out through the double-paned glass. But her aggressive hand gestures and the absolute fury in her posture were universally understood across all languages. She frantically dug into her deep coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and furiously dialed a number with trembling fingers. I figured the police would be involved eventually. So I went to the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and waited. About 15 minutes later, a local police cruiser slowly rolled down the street and parked near the curb. I knew this was my cue to make a physical appearance. I put my heavy winter coat on, unlocked my front door, and strolled outside, trying to look as casually curious as humanly possible. Brenda saw me emerge and immediately started jumping up and down, pointing her finger at me and screaming at the poor police officer who was just trying to get out of his vehicle. "Officer, arrest this man right now! He deliberately vandalized my car. He purposely ruined my $50,000 vehicle. He is a dangerous psychopath, and I want him in handcuffs." The officer, a relatively young guy who looked incredibly tired and clearly had not consumed nearly enough caffeine to deal with this level of suburban hysteria, slowly closed his car door. He looked at the massive, sparkling block of ice. He looked at the screaming woman in the fur coat. He looked at me calmly, sipping my coffee. And then, most importantly, he looked directly at the 2 giant, glowing neon orange no parking signs staked perfectly at the entrance of the lot. I casually walked up to the edge of the property line and said, "Good morning, officer." "Awfully cold one today, huh?" Brenda immediately lunged forward, trying to get in my face, and the officer had to physically step between us, holding his hand up. "Ma'am, please step back right now," he said firmly. He turned his attention to me, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Sir, can you explain to me exactly what happened to this vehicle?" I smiled politely, keeping my voice incredibly level and reasonable. "Well, officer, as you can clearly see by the posted signs, this dirt lot is my privately owned property. I have the legal boundary lines clearly marked with highly visible warnings. I recently put down some expensive winter seed in the dirt, and I installed a brand new irrigation system hooked up to an automatic digital timer to water the entire area overnight when the water pressure is best. I had absolutely no idea whatsoever that someone would blatantly ignore my legal signs, illegally trespass onto my land, and park their massive vehicle directly on top of my active running sprinklers during a publicly broadcasted severe freeze warning. The young officer blinked slowly. He looked down at the brass sprinkler heads peeking out of the ice. He looked up at the perfectly compliant, aggressively orange warning signs. He looked back at Brenda, whose face was now completely purple with rage. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice dropping into a completely flat, exhausted monotone. "Did you intentionally park your vehicle on this gentleman's private property after seeing those warning signs?" Brenda sputtered, waving her arms frantically. "That is completely beside the point. Look at my beautiful car. It is completely ruined. The expensive paint is going to peel off. The weather stripping is destroyed. He did this on purpose just to be cruel." The officer let out a long, heavy sigh. "Ma'am, the law is very clear here. This is his privately owned property. He is legally allowed to water his own dirt whenever he chooses to do so. If you willingly parked your vehicle here without his explicit permission, bypassing clearly posted warning signs, you assume all inherent risks associated with that trespass. This is entirely a civil matter. There is no criminal vandalism here. I cannot arrest him for watering his own lawn. Now, unless you specifically want me to write you a formal citation for criminal trespassing, which carries a hefty fine, I strongly suggest you figure out how to move your vehicle." Brenda looked like she had just forcefully swallowed a whole, unpeeled lemon. She gasped loudly, clutched the collar of her fur coat, and screamed that she was calling her insurance company immediately, and then she was calling her extremely expensive lawyer, and that we were both going to be sorry. The officer just shook his head, tipped his hat to me, told us both to keep the peace, got back into his warm cruiser, and drove away. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, "Oh well, she has premium insurance on a luxury vehicle. They will just pay for a professional tow truck and a heated garage to thaw it out." You would be dead wrong. I stayed outside, pretending to be intensely fascinated by checking my empty mailbox, specifically so I could eavesdrop on her phone call. She had her insurance agent on speakerphone because she was wearing thick gloves. She was practically sobbing into the receiver, dramatically explaining that her pristine vehicle was completely frozen solid in a field and she needed an emergency extraction team immediately. The insurance agent, sounding very confused, asked her for the exact location of the vehicle. She admitted very reluctantly that it was parked on the empty lot next to her house. I heard the agent type something on a keyboard. "Ma'am," the agent asked, "is the vehicle parked on a paved residential driveway? Did you have the property owner's explicit permission to park the vehicle in that specific location?" Brenda stammered, her voice cracking. "Well, no, not exactly. But it is literally just a dirt lot. It is just weeds." The agent's voice crackled coldly through the speakerphone. "Ma'am, I am looking at your specific policy details right now. Your comprehensive roadside assistance coverage explicitly does not cover emergency recovery from unpaved private property where the vehicle is parked illegally or without consent. That is legally classified as an off-road trespassing incident. Furthermore, we absolutely cannot dispatch a contracted towing provider to an unpaved, muddy field, especially under freezing conditions due to the extreme liability of their trucks getting stuck. Your claim for a subsidized tow is denied. You will have to arrange for a private, heavy-duty extraction service entirely at your own personal expense." She screamed, actually screamed at the phone, hung up violently, shoved the device deep into her pocket, and let out a wail of pure, unadulterated frustration that echoed down the block. She turned around, stomped her way back across the icy street, and slammed her front door so hard the glass panes rattled. It took over 2 hours for a tow truck to finally arrive. And it was not a normal tow truck. It was one of those massive, heavy-duty commercial rigs they use to pull fully loaded flipped semi-trucks out of deep ditches. The operator hopped out of the cab. He was a massive guy wearing insulated Carhartt coveralls, sporting a thick mustache, and holding a giant thermos of coffee. He walked slowly up to the frozen car, pulled a massive metal wrench out of his pocket, tapped the thick ice on the door, and slowly shook his head. "Lady!" he yelled loudly toward her house. Brenda came running out again. "I cannot hook this up!" he shouted over the idling engine of his truck. "The axles are frozen solid to the mud. The heavy tires are completely encased in 2 inches of ice. If I try to drag this heavy vehicle with my winch right now, I will rip your entire front bumper off. I will snap your tie rods, and I will shred all 4 of your expensive tires." "Well, what am I supposed to do?" Brenda shrieked, completely losing her mind again. The tow truck driver just shrugged his massive shoulders. "You have to melt it. Or at least, you have to pay me to melt enough of the ice around the wheels and the driver's side door frame so I can actually get inside the cab and shift the transmission into neutral. I absolutely cannot physically drag a heavy all-wheel drive vehicle while the transmission is locked in park over frozen muddy ruts." Brenda furiously demanded that he melt it immediately. The guy sighed, walked back to his massive truck, and pulled out a piece of equipment I did not even know tow truck drivers carried. He pulled out a literal, high-powered industrial blowtorch and a commercial heat gun. I am completely serious. He spent the next 2.5 hours on the clock at a rate that had to be well over $200 an hour, painstakingly blasting the solid, stubborn ice around her door hinges, the door seams, and all 4 wheel wells. The distinct, acrid smell of melting ice, burning mud, and slightly scorched automotive clear coat filled the crisp morning air. It was a slow, agonizing, highly expensive process. Eventually, after a tremendous amount of effort and cursing, he managed to pry the driver's side door open. The thick ice sealing the door gap violently cracked with a sharp sound that resembled a gunshot, sending huge, jagged chunks of ice flying everywhere across my lot. He climbed inside the freezing cab, wrestled the gear shift into neutral, climbed back out, and hooked his massive, heavy steel chains securely to the undercarriage. He walked back to his truck and engaged the hydraulic winch. The massive diesel engine roared loudly, the thick steel cable pulled tight, and the luxury vehicle let out a horrific, metal-bending groan. The heavy tires literally ripped themselves violently out of the frozen mud ruts, leaving huge, deep chunks of ice and black rubber marks scattered behind. He slowly, painfully dragged the heavy vehicle up onto the steel flatbed. The damage was extensive and completely undeniable. The entire pristine white front bumper was visibly warped and cracked from the expanding ice. The driver's side mirror was dangling loosely by a single wire where the ice had expanded and broken the internal joint, and the expensive rubber weather stripping around the door frame was completely torn to shreds from him violently prying it open. The tow truck driver walked over to Brenda and handed her an itemized invoice attached to a clipboard. The bill must have been absolutely astronomical, considering the heavy-duty rig, the hazard pay, and the 3 hours of manual labor. She signed the paper with a visibly shaking hand, keeping her head down, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. The giant truck slowly drove away, carrying her battered, half-frozen, utterly defeated luxury tank down the street. I walked over to the center of my lot, casually kicked the remaining chunks of broken ice out of the way, and surveyed the area. The dirt was an absolute muddy disaster, but my 2 glowing neon orange signs were still standing tall and proud, guarding my territory like silent, triumphant, brightly colored sentinels. I never saw that pristine white luxury vehicle ever again. I heard through the neighborhood gossip grapevine a few weeks later that her comprehensive insurance claim for the subsequent repairs was completely denied because the damage was technically caused by her own negligence while actively committing a civil trespass. She had to pay entirely out of pocket for a brand new front bumper assembly, complete new weather stripping, a replacement mirror, and a massive, highly expensive mechanical realignment because violently dragging the vehicle out of those deep frozen ruts completely destroyed the front suspension. The grand total of her stubborn refusal to walk an extra 30 feet was rumored to be somewhere around $4,000. All of that money, all of that stress, and all of that humiliation simply because she felt her convenience was vastly more important than my property rights. Since that glorious, freezing Sunday night, not a single person has ever dared to park even a single tire on my lot. When the weather finally warmed up in the early spring, I went ahead and planted my little fruit trees just like I originally planned. They are growing absolutely beautifully. The heavy-duty commercial sprinklers work incredibly well for keeping them watered during the hot summer months, and every single time I turn the system on, I stand on my patio. I listen to that rhythmic mechanical clack, clack, clack sound echoing through the neighborhood, and I cannot help but smile a deep, deeply satisfied smile. Sometimes in life, you just cannot simply ask for basic respect. Sometimes, reasoning with entitled people is a completely mathematically impossible task. Sometimes, you have to literally freeze people out until they finally learn the hard way. And if someone ever looks you in the eye and tells you that your carefully established personal boundaries are just an empty field, you take a step back, you prepare your defenses, and you show them exactly what happens when they arrogantly cross into your territory. You stop being the polite, accommodating neighbor, and you become the petty, unyielding, highly destructive force of nature they absolutely never saw coming. You know exactly that feeling I'm talking about, right? It is absolute, pure, unadulterated bliss.